University. I'm here with two of my wonderful colleagues from George Washington University for the pleasant and exciting, uplifting topic, Scientists Under Siege, Addressing Researcher Harassment. I want to note that there is a bar over there, so if you need to go refresh your drinks midway through, we understand. So I'm here with Rebekah Tromble, my colleague in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. I'm here with Holden Thorp, who's also my colleague at GW, along with Editor-in-Chief of Science. And we're going to start by talking about the state of play and what they've seen and what they've been doing. Rebekah, I want to start out with you. Can you tell us about the Researcher Support Consortium, both what it is and what the backstory is of that project?
Happy to do that. I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory. I can wax poetic about this for a very long time. I will keep it brief today. But the work that I've been doing that led me to establish the Researcher Support Consortium actually started now almost 6 years ago, when a major research project that I was working on was announced publicly and faced really intense backlash. My face was splashed across the front page of InfoWars. I was lead story in so many of these outlets that are designed just to harass and intimidate people. And the threats that I experienced were so severe that I had to move offices and actually had extra police patrols outside of my home for a time. It really turned my life upside down. It took me about 6 months to feel like I was that I could start to step back out again. And when I did that, I knew that to take my power back in this moment meant that I needed to lean into what I'm best at, which is research. And I do political communication research, and I study basically all of the bad things that happen online. And since so much of this was driven by online harassment, I decided to make a very large portion of my research agenda focus on how members of expert communities, including scientists and scholars, but also journalists, experience these cases of what we refer to as occupational intimidation, and what we can do to stand up systems of support and defense for them. And so I've worked now on 2 projects. One is providing direct crisis management, case management support to journalists and researchers who are facing campaigns of intimidation and harassment for their work. And then the second is the Researcher Support Consortium, which is focused primarily on helping us get institutions to respond to this, making the case, which is frankly a lot easier than it was in September when the Researcher Support Consortium first launched, that these individualized attacks, these attacks targeting specific individuals, are actually part of a larger campaign to target higher education and science, and to help institutions understand how they can respond. So one of the things that we provide at researchersupport.org is an institutional toolkit, a toolkit for universities, but also that centers, departments, and even projects, right, that PIs on specific projects can use to evaluate the steps that they can put in place to protect themselves and their teams moving forward.
So it's a mix of crisis response and advocacy. Basically, it's a good idea when things go wrong to reach out to Rebekah, and also maybe before things go wrong. Holden, so you have been a professor, you've been a university administrator, you have been our editor-in-chief of science. I want to pose sort of the broad perspective question to you. Like, what have you been seeing in these roles, and how has the trust in science and responses to the scientific community been changing over the years?
Yeah, so there's always been threats and other kinds of intimidation around universities and higher education. Even 15 years ago when I became the chancellor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I had round-the-clock protection myself because I fired a popular football coach. So I had my own bodyguard for a while. And we saw lots of students intimidated. That was the early days online, but it still happened. I ended up handling a lot of those kinds of things myself because universities are funny places. Nobody wants to make a decision sometimes, and they come all the way to the president or the chancellor. And first couple ones that happened, I really didn't know what to do about that, but eventually I got a thing going with my IT security folks and police, and I could just say, all right, these are the things we're going to do to look after this person, and then I would call them and say, this is the chancellor, I'm sorry, this is the first time you're ever talking to me when it's a strained situation, but I've asked IT to do this, and I've asked the campus police to do this, and here's my cell phone number, and call me if you need anything. And it was always a privilege to do that because I've always felt that my role has been to protect, whether I was an administrator or the editor-in-chief of science, to protect the independence of people who are sharing evidence. And I think that now we're in an environment where some of the evidence is so unwelcome in our society that we're seeing intimidation of lots of people. And in my current role, and a lot of that happens, frankly and sadly, within the scientific community because it's not like we don't have our own power struggles and power politics and things inside science. So I have to protect our editors when they make a decision about a paper. I've never overturned a decision about a paper made by one of our editors. If I did, we'd have a really screwed up system because it would mean people could come to me about a topic that I have no expertise in and say, I want you to change the decision of this person and all the reviewers who are all experts in quantum computing, which I could barely explain even if I wanted to. I have to protect, we have a news department, so of course I have to protect the independence of our journalists who often write things that are challenging to institutions and powerful individuals. And we have a robust process with our First Amendment lawyers and the protection of our journalists. We have to protect people who criticize science. So, there's a cottage industry of people who look at gels online to see if they've been altered. And they're a total pain in the neck, and some of them are very, very unpleasant to talk to. But if the evidence that they're bringing forward is correct, then it's my job to make sure that that evidence is considered without regard to where it came from or the style of the person who is bringing it. We see students who are pushed to do things by their lab leaders that conform to the hypotheses that the PIs have come up with. That's where most scientific misconduct comes from, when the PI says we're supposed to get this result, and a student with less power comes to the conclusion that they have no alternative except to produce that result using software tools. We have PIs who are intimidated by their institutions sometimes, and unfortunately now I'm very worried that their independence will be threatened by their funding sources if they're in the United States. And then finally we have communicators who are the people we should be relying on to propagate this information, and sometimes the scientific community itself isn't as accommodating of them as it should be. And so I have a crazy job where I have all of these things, and I had most of them when I was an administrator also, and of course it's gotten worse. But I think it's important to remember it wasn't non-existent 15 years ago, and it's gotten worse in the last 6 or 7 years. It's gotten crazy since November, and it's been absolutely insane for the last 3 weeks.
So that's a good. I don't want to call it good. Like, calling anything good right now feels false. That's a helpful bridge to what I wanted to raise next, which is, I imagine all of us are kind of facing this week that, like, any paper presentation you're giving was designed well more than 3 weeks ago. And we put together this panel more than 3 weeks ago. And these past 3 weeks have lasted several decades. So granting that researcher harassment is not new, it's not a thing that started in January, I do want to frame up for the two of you, what are the things that you are noticing and worrying about, especially now, that a month ago weren't the same level of concern? Like, in the past 3 weeks, what are the things that you think people in this room ought to be particularly worried about or aware of?
And I think there are very obvious things, right, which are the direct threats to funding and frankly, the solvency, fiscal solvency of our institutions. I think what is most notable for me in the last 3 weeks is while I have been doing this work for years, right, and have been at times trying to scream from the top of my lungs and feeling like I'm screaming into a void about the risks involved here. Most of those risks were to a relatively narrow slice of our overall scientific community. And so there was a real challenge to get both administrators, but also others in our community, other colleagues, to understand that this was something that they needed to pay attention to, this was something that they needed to provide support to their colleagues who were affected, and that this unfortunately was something that could come for them as well. And in the last 3 weeks, I think it's become much more abundantly clear that we are all in the same boat. And what we need is a collective community response in multiple ways, and we'll talk, I'm sure we'll talk later about some of the specific tips and ideas that I have for that. But I think that the main thing that I've been saying all along, but has much more credibility just in the last 3 weeks, much more resonance, is we absolutely have to lead from our core mission and values and use that to come together as a community, because we will not survive this moment unless we recognize how we can and should do that.
Yeah, right on. So I think the thing that worries me the most is, of course, all the individual things about the various kinds of cuts and federal scientists getting fired and studies getting stopped and papers potentially being withdrawn. We haven't had any withdrawn, but we're small, so the larger publishers probably have seen that. As all my years working in the academic environment in just about every possible capacity, I'm most worried that we, as Rebekah just said, won't find a way to come together to represent the deepest values we have about justice and knowledge, because we're preoccupied with arguing over the right way to resist, the right way to stand up for our values, or we're still sore that the administrators did something 2 years ago that we might have every good reason to be upset about, but whether we like them or not, they're the people who are there, and we need to support them right now. And I'm trying to do everything I can to foster a conversation about how this can happen. But on social media, for those of us who are on Blue Sky, if you say the littlest thing about, well, maybe we should do this differently next time. I'm not accusing you this, Dave, but maybe sometimes you say things along those lines. like, you're drawing a false equivalence between, you know, this little mistake that we made and these horrible things that are happening. Well, we still have to come up with a plan somehow for how we're all going to move forward. And the academic community is not really set up for that because we're all professional critics. That's how we got these jobs in the first place. So of course we're criticizing the administrators. Of course we're criticizing the neoliberal publishers. Of course we're criticizing the, you know, the New York Times for writing a headline that's a little bit too conciliatory. But the truth is, those are exactly the arguments that the strategy that is being carried out is designed to provoke. And if we don't figure out a way to facilitate a conversation where we can unite behind everybody who wants to defend justice and knowledge in the way that we have defined them for all these years, then it's going to be very hard for us to mount a comeback. And the same thing is happening politically. If you look at, you know, why the election was lost, nobody seems to be able to have a good conversation about how to win the next one. And so I'm just really worried about the fractioning of people who basically share the same goals and thinking a lot about how we overcome that. Of course, there are other probably bigger worries, you know, in the short term, like, are we even going to be able to keep doing all this stuff? But in terms of worrying about how we get past this and prepare to adapt to the constraints that we have in the future, I think Rebekah's absolutely right that we need to come up with ways to come together as much as we can. But at the same time, of course, academic freedom requires that, you know, people voice themselves in the way they want to voice themselves, and that's what makes academia and the scientific community great, is that, you know, there's 6 million scientists in the world. They're not going to get all on the same page, and we shouldn't try to do that. So how do we bridge all of these complicated challenges? I don't know. We're going to need some leaders to emerge who can help us do it.
So actually, I was going to bring us to another question. Do you want to mention the Guardian piece?
Yeah, so one of the first things that I would recommend folks do to try and understand how we can move forward from here is to better understand how we got here. And there's an article that just came out in The Guardian this morning. The title is, "We're Like Sitting Ducks. The War on Woke Has a Well-Tested Playbook to Take Down Academics." And it does a really fantastic job of illustrating a couple of key cases and what scholars have gone through, highlighting comments that those who have been targeting them have made and explicitly acknowledged that this is intended as a playbook, and these folks say, "We're coming for you." And then, you know, to help us all understand that for better or for worse, no matter what your politics, if you are if you are operating within a university right now, you have been labeled as part of the overall woke problem. Look at the lists that are being used in flagging grants at both NIH and NSF. They are frankly insane. They have keywords that catch up almost everything within them. And so in a moment when it would be tempting to say, well, that's not me, right? I'm in STEM, I don't do the social sciences or humanities, or I don't study these specific topics. It's okay, I can kind of put my head down and hide from this. Unfortunately, we are now in a situation where this impacts every single one of us together. And so for us to move forward, I think it's really important to understand how we got here, because we can't respond to the playbook unless we understand the playbook.
So bridging off of that, I want to invite the two of you to help put together our own playbook on the fly. Right, and it sounds like there's a proactive agenda. What should we be moving forward? There's also a reactive agenda. like, again, our title is Addressing Researcher Harassment. What are the things that we should keep in mind for when somebody ends up in the spotlight? So if Chris Rufo has his playbook and he is not shy in sharing it, I will note, having studied him a bit as well, he has a playbook. It has worked. The man is not a genius. Like, it's not that he's some strategic mastermind who we can never compete with. It's just that he's been running a playbook and nobody has been able to stop him yet. What should our playbook be? What would you like to have in there?
I'll just add before we start that that's also the same playbook that was run against tobacco, climate change, ozone. So we've had that playbook for 50 years. It's just being run on an industrial scale now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I tend to think about this in the moment when I'm talking to people. I tend to give tips in 3 broad buckets, right? One is, what can we do in this moment when, in fact, our institutions are under threat? And I think the most acute illustration of that right now is the threats to cuts of NIH indirect costs. We can expect those policies to impact, right, all of the other institutions. Thank you to AAU and others who are suing to stop those, but we have to plan not just for the idea that they could go into effect, but even if they don't, that they are going to, right, shape future negotiations around these things that are really, really impactful to the work that all of us do. So tips responding to the wider threat, tips for supporting each other, particularly in the scenario that you laid out, Dave, where an individual or specific individuals are targeting an individual or a number of colleagues. And then the third is tips for institutions. I'm not going to go through all of them all at once. Let me start with the tips for responding to the wider threat, because that's, I think, the main conversation that I've heard happening around AAAS so far. One of the things that I've heard in a number of rooms that I've attended is that we should keep doing the work. Scientists still need to science. And I think that's absolutely right. With the one qualification that I would say scientists also need to be talking about the work. That doesn't have to be screaming from the rooftops. It doesn't have to be reaching all of the policymakers and journalists. It can be everyday conversations with your neighbors, with your friends, folks who don't understand how these things operate and why your work is so important. It has never been more important than it is right now for us to convey to everyone we know why our work is, in fact, so important. For those who are willing and able to talk to policymakers and journalists, I think one of the key challenges right now is that so many feel ill-equipped to do that effectively, right? And again, I've been in a number of rooms today where there have been talks about, well, how can we train up people quickly to do this? I actually don't think we need to do that. I think what we need to do is for those of us who are in fields where we don't have, right, special knowledge about how to talk to policymakers, talk to journalists, and so on, we need to reach out to our colleagues in the departments that actually do have that expertise. So as I noted at the top, I'm a political communications scholar. Dave and I are in the School of Media and Public Affairs, which also has a journalism program. Our colleagues, right, are coming together right now, and not just at our institution, but across the nation, and thinking about what are the powerful messages that we can help provide to the media and to policymakers that will help us in this moment. And we're ready, willing, and able to support our colleagues in other fields to help tell the story of the work that you're doing. So let's try and get that message out there, and there are multiple ways that we can do it, even when we don't feel like it's necessarily in our wheelhouse or our specialty per se.
Yeah, and I think really the most important things haven't changed that much in the last 3 weeks. It's just that we weren't doing them very well before, and that's part of how we got into this situation. And, you know, if you read the stuff I write, I get on the case of the institutions quite a lot for not engaging and not answering questions and not being out there telling, not just telling the you know, they'll always say, oh, the journalists don't want to cover the positive news. Well, yeah, journalists, it's called news for a reason. The fact that there's people at GW doing great research isn't exactly news. So you have to, you can't whine about that. And every time there's something around my world, especially in research integrity or other things that happen that go wrong in the scientific enterprise, the institution never has a comment. They always, the most you'll get is a prepared statement of some kind, and they never take tough questions from a reporter. And so when you don't take questions from a reporter, tough questions from a reporter, the reporter and the public assume that you're covering something up. You might as well just say, I'm covering something up. That has gone on for so long that it's very easy to fill the void with this idea that science and these institutions are corrupt because they're always circling the wagons. And I learned this the hard way. If you have access to Google, you can find out that I went through a scandal at the University of North Carolina where I ended up telling everything eventually because I got religion at the last minute, thankfully. But I spent 2 years circling the wagons and making things way worse. So I'm sort of like a reformed smoker when it comes to this point. But I think the institutions and to some extent the scientists, when they've been criticized and attacked, as hard as it is, we have to face the tough questions. And that includes, unfortunately, in today's world, not just from the traditional newspapers, but also from all of the new media. And as long as so I think that's how you get just to the starting line of being able to get to the other side of this. So as long as the attorneys and the Marcom people, they call them, at the universities are telling everybody not to say anything, then it's going to be very hard for us to climb our way out of this.
So I want to follow up on a couple of things that you said, Holden. One, you highlighted that, in fact, journalists rarely tell the happy stories. I think right now we have an opportunity because the good work that we do is, in fact, under threat to tell both the happy story and the potentially dire consequences that can come from that good work going away, right? So those who are PIs on well-funded NIH projects that have direct impact on lives in your communities, whether it's creating jobs, right, and supporting the local economy, whether it's leading cancer research or mental health interventions for youth, people will understand that the work that you are doing has importance and that if it goes away, our communities are worse off, and in some instances, people may die. Right? It is literally that dire in many circumstances, and we can tell those stories. Right? And again, there are colleagues, look for colleagues in political science, in journalism, in communication science, who are ready, willing, and able to help work with you to shape, right, all of that. The second thing that you were talking about, Holden, pretty extensively is the role of institutions there, and so I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to go to my tips for institutions. In talking about tips for institutions, the first thing that I think we need to remember is that institutions are not just big. It's not just massive scientific associations like AAAS. It's not just universities and university presidents, provosts, deans, associate deans, but institutions live within those institutions, right? So projects, centers, departments. If you are a leader in any of those areas, including being a PI on a project, you need to remember that you have people that you are responsible for in this moment. And The thing that I am hearing from everyone right now is no one is communicating with us, right? We're hearing from, maybe there's an email that goes out from the provost or the president that says, keep spending, we're working on it. That's better than nothing, but it's not nearly enough. And it is right, it is accurate that our institutional leaders at the highest levels can't say a ton publicly. They are, in fact, constrained right now, but they can communicate internally, and crucially, they can share information down the food chain within these institutions and rely on those who are closer to the students, PhD students, faculty, right, to share. And it doesn't even have to be, right, details of strategy, but here are some concrete ways that we are actually rising to this moment. You're not going to hear publicly, we can't talk about it publicly, but here are some of the things that we're doing. And by the way, we are leading with our mission and values in all of this. And know that we believe in you and your work, and we see as part of our job the responsibility to protect you and your work. For institutional leaders, again, at any level, project PIs on up, please visit the website, researchersupport.org. Again, we have a number of resources and tools there. But you can also reach out. There's, on the About Us page, there's an email address. It's researchersupport@proton.me. Reach out to us directly, and there are a number of us that are providing workshops, risk assessment, and planning sessions, again, at all levels for the institution. We need to, within our institutions, recognize that this is a form of occupational hazard. It is occupational intimidation. We have institutional responsibilities because it is the work itself that's putting people at risk.
Yeah, I just want to say I've written a couple or three pieces in the last couple of weeks pleading with the institutions to say more. They're starting to. It's unfortunate that it took the indirect cost thing, which was a direct financial thing, to induce them to do that. They could have been doing it a few weeks earlier when some of these other things were in. I agree with my colleagues on the left that that's a fair criticism, but or to my left. I think that one of the things that they is easy to forget when you're in those chairs, as have been, is, and a lot of people would say about my time as an administrator that I spent too much time getting the campus on board and not enough time worrying about the external stuff. If you do it the other way, they'll say you spent too much time worrying about the external stuff and not enough about the campus. But my philosophy was always that, you know, James Kirk always put the 432 crew members of the Starship Enterprise ahead of Starfleet Command. And he was willing to get in trouble with the suits if he had his crew behind him. And when you have your campus behind you as a university leader, you have a lot more influence than you might think. Because, for one thing, if you have to leave your institution, it's going to be a whole lot easier to go to another one if you left the faculty and the staff and the students in a good place, because they're likely to be on the committee that's going to hire you for your next job, and they're going to talk to their friends. So that's the practical part. But the sort of philosophical part is that when there's tens of thousands of people united sometimes, well, those tens of thousands of people are ones who are writing the papers and writing the proposals and teaching the classes, and there's kind of not a university without them. And so having those groups behind you puts you in a much stronger position than having being at odds with them because you're not saying anything and maybe doing better with the outside world. But it's very hard, just in empathy with the people who struggle with this, when you're surrounded by trustees and politicians and your professional administrators who aren't faculty, it's very hard to lose sight of that and think, oh, why doesn't the campus realize how hard I'm working for them right now? Well, because like I said, the whole point of the university is for them to be independent thinkers, and they don't spend all their time thinking about university accounting and federal relations and all the things. That's why you're there, so that they can focus on their scholarship and what they're learning, and you can handle all these political and external and administrative details. And so I just think and I wrote a piece complimenting the president of Brown, whose letter I thought was the best so far. And you know, when the indirect cost thing started, we started to see more. And I think we will, you know, as administrators realize that this is not a moment that you're just going to wait out, then I think we'll start to see more. Anything we can do to get there faster, I think would make a big difference.
Yeah, so I'll end my tip series with a handful of tips for essentially supporting one another. These apply whether you're in leadership or not. I think one of the things that, I'm going to say this and it will sound obvious, but I think actually most of us as human beings are really bad at this. Don't be dismissive when other people express their concerns. I've talked to quite a few, particularly PhD students, who say, when I talk to my faculty member, when I talk to my PI about these things, their response is, it's all gonna be okay, it's not that bad. And I get that, right? That feels like, if you're that PI saying it, it feels like you're trying to give reassurance. But if you haven't first acknowledged and validated the concern that they've expressed, and also tied in the it's going to be okay with an assessment of how you're working to support them to make it okay, it will feel fundamentally dismissive, and that's going to break down trust immediately. And that's one of the most important things that we cannot lose right now. We have to come together, feel like we can lean on one another. As hard as that's going to be, we have to communicate with one another in a way that feels supportive. Second, give space to your colleagues to talk more about this. Sometimes people really just need a listening ear, and they really need it from someone who is in their field, in their space, because it's very, very difficult, in fact, often traumatizing, directly traumatizing, to try to explain your fears and your anxiety to friends, to loved ones, to the people that you would normally turn to, but they don't understand the weird things that we do as scientists, right? It's so complicated, like explaining indirect cost rates to a normal human being, right? Holden,
I've been doing it for a week.
Exactly. You've been doing, the Lord's work out here for the last week trying to explain it to a general audience. But that's really, really hard. And I know for myself, right? If I have to go to my parents and talk about this, I'm avoiding it because it will just, I have to do all of the work to get them to understand. And so creating space for colleagues to express their fears and concerns is so empowering because they know at minimum you're going to understand the landscape and the circumstances. But the reverse of that is if you are then dismissive, for example, by saying simply, it's going to be okay, that hits even harder for people. So it becomes doubly important that we're not dismissive. Then there are 3 things that I always tell people that you can say essentially in any circumstance when people are expressing their fears, anxieties, concerns to you. First, I am so sorry. That seems obvious, but very few of us actually say that. Just saying I'm sorry is an acknowledgement, right, that helps push back against that sense of dismissiveness. Second, you don't deserve this, and that might be part of a, right, none of us deserve this, but make sure that you're sort of enveloping and making it clear that you think of that person as part of that. And then third, and honestly most important, is your work is so important, it is so good, it is so valuable, because we all know that our identities are wrapped up in the work that we do. And when people are coming after our work, they're coming after us, our hearts and our souls. Lift up the work. Help people understand that you see them, you value what they do, no matter the circumstances. And then last but not least, offer support in concrete ways. So offer to be a listening ear. Offer to provide a distraction. If somebody who just wants to go for a walk, have a coffee, not talk about any of this nonsense, you will be there for them in that moment. Offer to be a thought partner, but particularly that last one, don't force it on anyone. Because so often what we need in all of this is just that listening ear or just the distraction. We don't want somebody who's going to jump in and try and solve the problem for us. We're not in that space. But we might get there, right? So offer to be that if they want them. And then underscore that you have their back and how you have their back. So if in leadership, you'll advocate on their behalf with those who are higher up the hierarchy. And if your colleague in parallel, one idea that you can do very concretely is to help identify other colleagues who will offer statements of support. Not necessarily that are to be activated right this moment, not necessarily that would ever be released publicly, but simply knowing in our research what we found, one of the most effective tools that we can provide to shore people up is to help them recognize that they are embedded within a community of people who support them. And so offer, right? Who can you think of? Let me help you think through who are the people who are in your corner, and if you asked them to, would stand up, and I'll help go talk to them now, right? So they're prepared. They will only do the thing if you come to them and say, I need this thing right now, but they're there for you when you need them.
So in a minute, I want to open it up to Q&A. Before we do that, and I did not prep you with this, I'm throwing this, this is a surprise. This is a high turnout. This is an important topic that I think has a higher turnout in the room because of the moment we're in. There's been a lot of really good material on this panel. Since we are all professors, I want to invite each of you to select a homework assignment that you would give to the audience. So if there's one thing you want them to walk away thinking about or doing, what's the one thing?
I think it's thinking about, I need two things. I'm sorry, Dave, I need two.
This, put this on Rate My Professor, but Rebekah is giving you two homework
giving you two homework assignments. I think the first, and honestly the foremost, is to just take a look around, be aware of who around you may need support and may not be expressing it. The second assignment is to think about, do you have a story that could be told in this moment, and who might you tell it to? So is that family, friends, members of your community? Is it particularly working with colleagues who know how to frame this up for policymakers and journalists? Those are the two homework assignments.
Yeah, and I guess I would just build on what Rebekah was saying, which is a minute ago, which is go find someone who's anxious and tell them that it's understandable that they're anxious, rather than telling them it's all going to be okay. If you tell them that first, then you can start talking about, oh, we've been through these kinds of things before and all of that. But if you start by saying something that to them sounds like calm down, you're just going to make them more anxious. And there's plenty of papers in the science family of journals to support the fact that this is true, which we'd be happy to send you. But it's human nature to tell anxious people to calm down. And if we could get some of that out of the system, then that would be the step to getting ourselves to a place where we could start planning not just how we're going to respond in this moment, but more importantly, what we're going to do in a year when we know where we stand and have to rebuild this whole thing back.
So Holden's both giving us an activity assignment, and it sounded like a bunch of reading.
Yeah,
Very
sure.
professor. Love it. Let's open up to Q&A now. Who has a question?
I have a question and a comment. As somebody who's been a long-time attendee here, when we talk about an affirmative playbook, the other playbook has targeted K through 12 pretty obviously. We need to bring back family science days because we need to, if we don't want scientists under siege, we need scientists respected. Why have we not brought back family science days?
I have no idea. Fortunately, the journals are independent of AAAS, but I'll be happy to find somebody who can answer that for you.
A few months ago, I was sitting on an airplane next to somebody who was watching Fox News, and the Trump commercials came on, showing a flamboyantly transvestite person saying, "She's for them, we're for you." And what occurred to me is the way they won was not to go for people's minds, but to go for their gut. I would love to have seen during the Super Bowl or other big commercial-heavy activities something from the science world saying, they're doing this, here's what's going to happen to you. I think we need to speak on that level, and I wonder what your reaction to that is.
I mean, I want to be very cautious here because I don't want to sink to that level, and yet, right, I'm a political communication scholar, right? Part of my brain focuses on strategic communications at this moment. We are in a hair-on-fire moment in so many different ways, and we need messages. In fact, another additional little homework assignment, everybody should go read Tressie Cotton's most recent column in the New York Times that talks about how basically everybody, including the science community, is missing the mark because we are all playing to old school media moments and values, and we are right now in a hyperbolic social media moment. And so we need to tell our stories in really powerful ways that do in fact get to the gut, right? That do in fact make these dire stakes, because they are. That is hard for scientists because we're perpetual critics, because we like nuance appropriately. We recognize that the world is not black and white, but this is a black and white moment. People will die if our society allows so many of these policies, and particularly those focused on science and higher education, to go through. I agree with you. We have to tell those stories in that way with that power.
Yeah, and the whole thing about, first of all, the othering of transgender people makes me sick to my stomach. I don't know what to do about it, but it's horrible because of the complicated politics that it works to do that. So somebody who knows more about politics needs to solve that for me. But I think when we think about science communication and communication about higher education, we have to start by remembering something that's called the scholastic fallacy in sociology, which says that academics tend to assume that everybody thinks about problems the same way they do. Nobody understands how we do research. Nobody understands peer review. Nobody understands that we post all these data on Zenodo and GitHub. Nobody understands all these arcane committees that we have in the university. Nobody understands that we have curriculum committees and all this stuff. No one knows any of that, and there's no reason for them to. They're out doing their job, trying to take their kids to school, and so we have to be, but we have a tendency to try to explain ourselves by assuming that people automatically stipulate that all of those things are good things. And so what worries me whenever, I think a lot of communication around this falls prey to that same problem. And, you know, I think as far as arguing about the indirect costs or the other cuts to the institution, the only thing that I think has any chance of getting any traction is that there's going to be all these layoffs in Birmingham and Pittsburgh and St. Louis and, you know, red state places that have huge academic medical centers. That's what I think the politicians are most likely to respond to. The details of whether this social science study, which addresses this thing that they've outlawed, actually helps more people with heart disease get better, and that ends up helping everyone who has heart disease, or lowering the cost of medical care. I mean, that's just too complicated of an argument to make. Not that it isn't correct, but I just don't think it's a winner.
Yeah, I totally agree. I add on to that just one small extra point, which is that we need to be talking about the stakes, right? And this very serious stakes here. And Holden, your point about emphasizing this in red states and communities that will be, because this is not red or blue, right? This impacts everyone. I think some of those thinking strategically that way is important, but we also don't want to run the risk that we empower sweetheart deals behind the scenes happening for specific institutions. So we need to talk about the local stakes and the larger stakes side by side.
So thank you so much, first of all, for the work you're doing. I think is super important, having been on the receiving end of being politically attacked for my science a few years ago. There was nothing like this in the horizon, so I really had to do a lot of it on my own, and that was pretty scary. But I think that in the current moment, what feels even scarier is that the strategies that you might have used in the past to, for example, to stay away from social media if you're being attacked, don't feed the trolls, et cetera, are no longer really what's going to get you out of the pickle, right? Because now the attacks are coming both from the government and from the general public and people out there. So it doesn't feel like there is a safe space anymore, right? Where we can sort of hunker down and recharge and then push forward. It's just like, in a way, it just feels like everything is coming in at the same time, and that's just not sustainable, right, for our mental health and our well-being.
Yeah, which is why the answer here is community, right, and community support. It's not, we do the work, I talked about the first part of the project, that is to get a crisis management case manager to someone who is in the midst of an attack. But the core work that we do as part of that is what we refer to as community mapping. And we sit with folks and we talk through a number of different key roles that you are going to need in your life, right? From the listening ear, the distractor, to the core strategist, right? To people who will help you monitor social media spaces and so on. And so we walk through that, right, step by step with people, because what we know is that we get through difficult moments. We build resilience when we have community around us. So this is not, there's no one size fits all. In some instances, people can shrink back from the public sphere, social media and otherwise, and it does get better. In other instances, that makes absolutely no difference. And so we do it on a case-by-case basis to evaluate what the needs are, what people themselves feel up for, but most importantly, how we wrap an entire community around that person to effectively weather the storm for both short, medium, and long terms.
Hi, it's Matthias. I'm the spokesperson of Dresden University of Technology in Dresden. So first of all, thank you very much for the also, I think, personal insights into your experiences, and thank you very much for the support and empowerment for scientists so that they not resign when they're facing hatred or harassment during a public debate. I think it's very important work. So also in Germany, we know this phenomenon, hatred towards science. And this is how it comes that me and two colleagues, we founded a couple of years ago this such called SciComm support. It's a support platform also for scientists. And I think our target group is a little bit wider. It's also for science communicators who are facing hatred, for example, press officers. So, and the support we are doing are 3 levels. One is communication consulting, it's legal support, and it's psychological support. And also we are doing trainings and workshops and things like this. So for me, it would be important to know how you actually help researchers or science communicators. How is the approach? For example, we have a hotline. It's open from 8 to 10, and every people facing this situation can call and they get our support. So how you're doing this with your platform?
Yeah, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. What I didn't say when I described my incident from 6 years ago now is that it happened when I was an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. All of the hate was coming from the US, but the impacts were like it was serious enough that I had to move offices and have extra police support in the Netherlands. So this is truly a global phenomenon, and we're really seeing things ratchet up in Europe right now. So thank you for the work that you're doing. I have to be just a little bit cagey in answering your question right now, because the first part of the work that I was talking about, the crisis response, is itself under threat. And so we have, the idea here and the way this normally works is we have a beautiful website that people come to, can learn more about the work, but very quickly do an intake form that's then reviewed. We built a bespoke, secure technical case management system on the backside of all of this because we didn't trust out-of-the-box third-party providers to actually protect the sensitive data that we were going to be operating with. So we've got this whole system stood up. We've had to go quiet on that front part. So what I can say right now is if you know someone, you are someone who is being threatened, is under attack right now, that email address that I gave you earlier, researchersupport@proton.me, is the most effective way. If you know somebody who's 1 or 2 steps removed from my personal networks, also, right, have them help get to me directly, and we will get people into the system. So we're having to do this a little bit, unfortunately at the moment, a little bit indirectly, but still we're finding lots of folks who are effectively getting to us.
Hi, my name is Vikram. Also, I apologize, this question is going to be a little rambly. But earlier, we were talking about how it's a familiar playbook that's being used against academics. And part of what I'm feeling is that what's different is the scale of it and like the magnitude of, the number of people being, mobilized to do all of this. And thinking myself, like when I write about whatever is happening or try to express my opinions, and this probably goes for all of us as academics, like, it takes a little time to come up with those thoughts, to organize them, make sure like you're using the accurate information and all of that, and that takes a lot of time and effort compared with like just it's easy to troll or harass or lie and spread misinformation and destroy things, and that's kind of what we're seeing on a very large scale of, the difficulty of building things of value versus, just tearing it apart. And so I guess my question is, do you have ideas of like how to, confront just like the scale of the harassment and the attacks and all of that?
Yeah, the scale now is so huge that there's truly no one answer. But this is why, sort of in my homework assignment, I'm trying to bring it down to a level that each and every one of us can actually, in practical terms, activate. There are a number of us who, even though we came into this work to be traditional empirical scientists, have also been doing the advocacy work, and we're going to be there, and you will find that we exist sort of all through these networks to then help lift up the work that others who don't sort of have that advocacy bone right in them can, to lift up the stories and the messages that they want to share and so on. So I think one of the things that it's really important for everyone walking away from this to hear is that you don't have to do everything in this moment in order to contribute to the solution in this moment. Support people who are around you. Be kind and caring to those who are around you. Talk to those who you have solid relationships with, who are in positions of power and influence. And think about how you can tell your story, bridge divides so that you can tell those stories effectively, and that will actually make a difference right now. We are, in fact, as individuals, empowered, even if it feels totally overwhelming and like, how do we can respond because, right, all of the atoms that we represent make up the ocean.
Yeah, I just would add, I think anyone in a leadership role, another way in which we need to be patient with them is that the way institutions go down is when they get overwhelmed, right? And so whenever you see a president resign or you see, bad things happen to an institution, it's because they couldn't keep up with all the things, and eventually stuff starts coming out that they can't get ahead of, right? Because they're too busy solving 3 problems ago. And so the institutions are right to not go after everything, as frustrating as that can be. And unfortunately, those of us, I'm just a regular faculty member at GW, I have to trust that our administration is going to pick the right things. Because if they pick everything, I know they're going to lose, because I've been in those shoes. And they can't, there's just no way they can do it all. So remembering that we have to pick the things that are where we have a great argument and that are so core to what we're doing that those are the things we have to engage on. And it's frustrating because you leave it to the side other things that are also important, but we're just going to have to go back and do those later.